Hello, everyone, and welcome back to TWIML Fest. This is our Coded Bias screening and conversation with the director and a couple of the folks that featured in the film. Welcome, excited that you can join us. So we are going to jump right in. I hope you had a chance to watch the film. It's been available for the past few days, and we had a group screening that just concluded. I will start out by introducing the folks that are joining me for this discussion. And while I'm doing that, please get your questions ready and submit them via the chat, which should be just to your left or right or down or somewhere adjacent to the video that you're watching right now. So first up, I'd like to introduce Shalini Kantayya. Shalini is the director and producer of Coded Bias. She's a Brooklyn-based filmmaker and activist known for her debut feature film, Catching the Sun, which focuses on the race for a clean energy future. Shalini, welcome to the panel.
Thank you so much for having me and for bringing Coded Bias to your festival.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for making it. Next up, I'd like to introduce in Deb Raji. Deb is a 2020 Mozilla Fellow who's worked closely with the Algorithmic Justice League, founded by Joy Buolamwini, and on several projects to highlight the cases of bias in computer vision. Deb, welcome.
Hello, thanks for having me.
And next, I'd like to introduce Meredith Broussard. Meredith is an assistant professor at NYU and author of Artificial Unintelligence, How Computers Misunderstand the World. She's an associate professor at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute there at NYU. Meredith, welcome.
Hi, it's so great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I am excited to have all of you. So, hey, it's Saturday, early afternoon where I am. You know, let's just kind of lean into this festival vibe and get an interesting chat going. All of you who are watching are welcome to join in. I'd love to start with a little bit of the backstory. Shalini, tell us a little bit about how this project evolved. How did you come across Joy's work in the first place? What inspired you to take this on? How did it all start?
Well, first of all, thank you again for bringing the film, and thanks for everyone for taking time on a Saturday to talk about movies and engage with these ideas. It gives me a lot of hope. I sort of stumbled down the rabbit hole. I love technology. I'm a sci-fi fanatic. And a lot of my body of work has to do with disruptive technology and how it impacts the marginalized. And with my previous work, I was sort of looking at solar energy and how could it uplift, you know, sort of working in middle-class communities. And with this film, I didn't know anything about algorithms or AI, short of what Stanley Kubrick and Steven Spielberg taught me. And I sort of stumbled upon the work of Joy Buolamwini and Kathy O'Neill and Meredith Broussard and Sophia Umoja Noble and all of these amazing scholars and research, and sort of stumbled down the rabbit hole of the sort of dark underbelly of big tech. And I think quite along Joy, who is just basically trying to make an art project work and stumbles upon, racial bias in commercially available facial recognition that's already being sold to the FBI and to ICE and to law enforcement. We sort of stumbled down the rabbit hole with her and sort of move from, like, for me, I am so grateful to the cast of the film for giving me such a profound education in some of these technologies. And really, these women are so brilliant that I usually get only half of what they say, and half is a lot. So, and I could get like a small bit of that of their genius into this film. So I'm very grateful to them. And I think what they've shared was terrifying to me, which is that so many of these technologies, first of all, I didn't really fully understand the way AI is going to transform our world and everything that we care about, and is already making such important decisions about who gets hired, who gets healthcare, how long a prison sentence someone serves. And what I learned through these brilliant data scientists and mathematicians was that this stuff that we trust so implicitly with our decision making more and more sometimes is not vetted for racial bias, for gender bias. Sometimes we don't even know if it's accurate, if it's fair, if it's not even tested in some cases that'll not do unintended harm. And so I started to see, with no rules in place, through the characters, the activists who, fight back and oftentimes win. I mean, that's one of the beautiful things about the film, I think, is that it's still manages to be optimistic and hopeful, because it shows the power of people when they speak out and make whether it's sharing groundbreaking scientific research or exercising your voice. And so I hope the film will be a conversation starter on so many of the issues in it.
Awesome. Meredith, you come to this from the perspective of a journalist. Can you share a little bit about your work and background and book and all that journalism kind of brings to the conversation?
Sure. So what I say is that my academic research is about artificial intelligence for investigative reporting. But I wrote the book because I was working on this project that I called the Story Discovery Engine that helped journalists to quickly and efficiently uncover new story ideas in public data. And I would explain that I was doing this, and people would say, "Oh, you mean like you made a robot reporter?" And I would say, "Well, no, but that sounds cool." And I realized that artificial intelligence is this thing that we use and we accept is happening, but we don't really understand it. So I started talking about the nitty-gritty of AI in plain language as part of my journalism practice. And I come to journalism kind of by a roundabout way. I started my career as a computer scientist. I worked at T-Bell Labs. I worked at the Media Lab where Joy studies. But one of the reasons that I quit was because of the misogyny and the racism. The tech industry is better nowadays than it was when I quit, but it still has a long way to go. So when I write about AI ethics and I write about the problems of artificial intelligence, it's informed by my own experience with being in the tech industry and just becoming really disillusioned by it. And so the book is about how do we understand the inner workings and outer limits of technology. So that's actually what brought Shalini and me together. We ended up in a conversation about AI, and one thing leads to another, and now we're here talking about this amazing movie.
That's awesome. And Deb, you play a central role in all of this.
The bowling scene.
The bowling thing. How did you do in that bowling game?
I am not a good bowler. I was trying to convince them. Shalini probably remembers. I was like, let's do anything, mini golf, like anything. I can throw like discus, anything. Axe throwing. Can we do anything? And she's like, no, bowling is an aesthetic thing. I'm like, okay, I'll try. But yeah, it was really fun, and I love hanging out with Joy. And Shalini is obviously amazing and incredibly gifted as a documentary director, so she knew what she was doing. But yeah, glad to be here. I definitely sort of have a similar story to Meredith in the sense that I was very much on the side of the people that were creating these algorithms. I was very into like tech entrepreneurship, and then I ended up working at a startup, a computer vision startup, and learning about machine learning and getting really into it. I just thought it was so effective. That was my first impression. And I think the longer I actually worked as a machine learning engineer building these systems, the more disillusioned I became. So actually, I was a really big fan of Meredith's book because it was a very, I think some people would describe it as a much more measured take than a lot of the work that was out there at the time, where everyone was very optimistic about AI, and it was sort of a more realistic, grounded perspective on things. And I think that I was sort of also in a phase too, where I realized that I definitely had a different experience, like a different lived experience than a lot of my peers at the time. I stood out in a lot of ways. I was like the only like Black woman for miles in any conference I would go to. And I was beginning to feel really isolated. And it was actually by chance that I went to 2017 NeurIPS and saw like an afro in the crowd and waved her down, and it was Timnit. And she invited me to join the Black in AI workshop, which is pretty much a community she's created of Black researchers in the space. And it was like the only time outside of working with Joy that I had sort of seen, Black researchers doing this kind of work. And it kind of reaffirmed to me just the importance of our contribution and our perspective in the conversation of like how we build AI and what AI can look like in the future. So it was really after that experience that I began, working with Joy on her work on her work on gender shades and a lot of the advocacy work that's featured in the film. And then from there, it kind of escalated. I was supposed to spend a summer at the Media Lab working with her, and we're like, okay, we're gonna like start with this question, end with this answer, and I can kind of keep going and keep doing the machine learning engineering thing. I'm not sure if you can still hear me. Sorry about that. But yeah, I think eventually it just kept going. There were just more questions to ask and answer. And things just kept going and kept escalating. But she's definitely been a great sort of mentor for me in this space. And I'm really excited that I had a small role to play in that film and have been able to participate with her in a lot of the advocacy work.
That's awesome. And what are you doing now as a Mozilla Fellow?
I'm keep like sort of still answering that same question I thought would take a summer to answer. We're looking into sort of how to formalize algorithmic auditing practice so that we understand the set of questions that we want to bring into a situation. We have a procedure and we have tools that we can use to help us actually analyze these systems even when they're deployed. So I'm working on a lot of that, building resources and frameworks around how to do that auditing work.
Shalini, in your intro, you mentioned sci-fi as kind of a grounding point for you, and we had a little discussion in Slack while we were watching the movie after that sequence of sci-fi movies, what folks' favorites were. I'm curious, if you have a favorite AI in sci-fi film or
Yes.
show or something, and if so, what that is, and more broadly, kind of how you see the role of film as kind of impacting technology.
Well, anyone who loves me or tries to love me has to watch Gattaca. As like sort of required viewing to be in my life. I just think it's an extraordinary movie, and in some ways has a lot to do with what we're talking about in terms of a different kind of determinism. This idea that your destiny is sort of pre-made by the data of the past. And that kind of determinism, which Meredith sort of upends in her work. And I think that by saying the data from the past can't predict the future is kind of anyway. And Alex Garland, who was the sci-fi maker of Ex Machina in his new sci-fi series Devs, says the people who program the future, basically that people who know so little about the past shouldn't be in charge with predicting the future. And I thought that was really telling. I love sci-fi so much. I mean, and I feel like it's so much a part of, anyway, the way I think of the world in some ways, my worldview. But I want to say that almost everything that we know about AI is through the lens of science fiction artists and storytellers and writers. And I think that when I was trying to translate the research and trying to translate it to a visual medium, I sort of pulled from these tropes of Steven Spielberg and Minority Report and Stanley Kubrick, his computer HAL. And through Meredith's scholarship, came to know that Marvin Minsky, who was one of the fathers of AI, was in dialogue with Arthur C. Clarke, who was the designer of HAL, to the robot, the bad robot, in 2001. And so I feel like there's always been this dialogue between writers and artists stretching imagination and what technologists create. And I think our imagination has been stifled by what Joy calls the coded gaze, or what Meredith calls techno-chauvinism, this idea, this very small group of people, not just like, being overwhelmingly the people that design these technologies, but also the people who imagine the science fiction our science fiction futures. And so I'm so grateful that I really think that the cast of the film sort of inspires us to have a different imagination about these technologies. And I think that's sort of the relationship between art and what's real. It's like we have to imagine it first. And I think in some ways we've been tricked to believe that these are the only ways these technologies can work. These are the only economic models that these technologies can work on, in these sort of predatory models. And I think in the making of this film, I learned that there are a lot of different ways. And, as an artist and as I actually believe that limitation spawns innovation. And I think that we should put some rules on technology so that we can spark this new era of imagination and innovation, but have some limitations of doing it in the context of democratic ideals.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't realize that Alex Garland did Devs, but now that you mention it, kind of the visual feel of the house in Ex Machina and the kind of secret, future dev layer in Devs there's a clear linkage there.
He's amazing. Yeah, I'd be curious if you guys think his science is legit, but
his science is very fantastical. Like, I watched Ex Machina and Devs back to back, And I love Nick Offerman, and I had been actually avoiding watching Ex Machina for several years, and my husband said, "Okay, you have to watch this. Like, if you are going to talk about AI, you have to watch this movie." Well, so I watched it, and it made me angry, like in exactly the same way that I thought it would make me angry. Because like it's about having robot women as sex slaves. Like, yeah, like that is a trope in science fiction, and it makes me angry because it is anti-feminist. Like the idea that you want to make a sex robot just because, so like it's, I don't know. There's all kinds of layers of oppression there. So science fiction is so fantastic, as Shalini said. Like, I am also like a longtime sci-fi fan. I just think it's so important to like separate what's imaginary from what's real. And if we go back to, say, Golden Age science fiction, like there are no Black people in Golden Age science fiction at all. And that's a factor of unconscious bias. I mean, it might be conscious bias, but I would like to be generous and say it's unconscious bias. And so the field of artificial intelligence, just like the field of computer science overall, just like the field of mathematics, which computer science is a descendant of, like has a raging problem about sexism and racism and classism and like all kinds of snobbiness. And the field has just never explored that. And so the unconscious bias of this small and homogeneous group of people who are dominating the fields of math, computer science, physics, etc., those unconscious biases are getting embedded in the technologies that those people create and that all of us use and all of us contribute to.
Yeah, I wanted to just add to that because I watched Her, which is sort of, and I got really upset. I got really mad. And I also got mad at Ex Machina as well. And I think it's a similar thing of, these are obviously like very considered and beautiful works of art. The vision that they have for technology is ambitious. I think another part of what frustrated me and probably frustrates a lot of us as like women of color is that, the promise of technology doesn't always stand for us. So I think there's an understanding that you kind of have of the limits of what technology can do. You don't buy in as easily to the vision, because even on the screen, you're seeing like who it works for and you're wondering who it doesn't work for just because of the nature of how that dynamic plays out in the real world. So, I think, on one hand in my mind, I'm like, oh, that's not how chatbots work. How would that even be possible? Like in my mind, there's sort of the logistical burden of that. But even if you suspend that belief, there's still so many like values and prejudices that like, intentional or not, find their way into like, we sort of, so one example is with chatbots, like a lot of the, in Her, it was this like female voice, this very sort of like, and with a very specific type of personality, a very specific type of female personality that kind of aligns with misogyny in a lot of ways, and it can become very problematic. And it wasn't too far of a leap from some of the papers I've read on like conversational AI and like the ideal personality. Like I've read a lot of papers where they'll discuss setting the personalities for chatbots to be that of like an 18-year-old, like flirtatious and like, obedient, like female, like assistant or something. And it's just like such a weird, like specifically male, grounded to a specific cultural expectation, like fantasy of what AI is supposed to be and how it's supposed to present itself. That I do think that we're now at a point that because we have, part of why we're having this conversation now is because a lot of women, a lot of people of color are finally asserting their existence as like full people that will have to also interact with AI. Like it's not just for that dominant group that we're building these tools and these systems, it's for everyone. And as a result of that, the fantasy for one person is a nightmare for another person. So I think that's like, I totally resonate that, like, yeah, sci-fi is this great inspiration, but it also really highlights, you know, whose fantasy we're working towards as a field, and how we might need to think more creatively and imagine different kind of realities.
You know, Deb, I'm reminded of something that Nicholas Negroponte said about, Nicholas Negroponte, one of the leaders of the Media Lab, said about news technology. So at one point he said, well, every day my wife reads 5 newspapers and clips out articles for me that she thinks that I'll find interesting. And why can't we just make a computer program that does that? And I think about this when I think about the fantasy of automated news, right? Because people do have all these things that
Yeah.
they imagine that journalism is going to be in the future, right? And I just think like that shows such enormous disrespect for the labor that goes into curating. And I think about, my God, like people get paid to do that job of reading 5 newspapers and picking out what's important, and saying, oh, let's just make a program that does that, just is enormously disrespectful to the amount of work and care that goes into that process. And it also betrays like a fundamental misunderstanding of what you can and can't do with computers.
Mm-hmm.
Is it the way that is said, you think, that creates the disrespect, or the very idea of using a computer to replace someone's labor that is the source of the disrespect?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that automation in general is really useful. Like there are so many things in my life that I am so happy to have automated. And then there are other things that actually a human does much better than a computer. And so saying, oh, we should just make a computer do this because this doesn't have value, is a way of undermining the human effort that went into it. And actually, this goes back to the, oh, Deb, go ahead.
Oh, no. I want you to finish. I have a comment, but I'll add it.
Okay.
Once yours.
I was going to talk about firing tables. So this goes back to the very beginnings of computing. God, I forget who it was. There's this quote about how men of substance should not waste their time doing mere arithmetic, that you could just like hire peons to do arithmetic. And this was the guiding principle for a very long time. And in warfare, gunners had to use these things called firing tables in order to figure out like what angle they were going to put the cannon at, and how far that how far you needed to shoot your artillery. And the way that you calculated this was you used some complex math, but nobody can do complex math when they're being shot at. Okay, so they had these things called firing tables that you would use to look up the appropriate angle. So when you're on the ship and you see the other ship and you need to shoot your gun, you can aim it appropriately and kill the maximum number of people. So computing these firing tables was just kind of grunt work, and there were often mistakes. And if there was a mistake in your firing table, then your ship could get blown up, and that was bad, right? Obviously, it was bad. So there was a push to use machines to generate firing table. And so this is how computing started, right? So we had machines that did simple calculations, and the development of the digital computer was spurred by the impetus to calculate better firing tables. And the firing tables were made by human computers, right? So if you remember in Hidden Figures, the stars had jobs as human computers. Yeah, that was a real job, but those jobs got automated out of existence. And there was a lot of disrespect for those jobs in the first place. But the thing is, like, those were good jobs for people. They were jobs that were worthy of respect. So when I think about computer scientists being disrespectful about human labor, that's the kind of thing that I think about. It goes back to the earliest days, and it shows like how they're just not respecting other people in the way that I think people ought to be respected.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, like my impression of that is sort of when I see what I call mom apps coming from like Silicon Valley, where like there's an app to do your laundry and like an app to make you breakfast, like everything that your mom used to do, like that's sort of what you know, a lot of the sort of Silicon Valley guys will sort of try to automate, and it on one hand it's a little bit like it feels like a distraction from some of the very, you know, the harder fundamental questions that they could be addressing with technology. But on the other hand, it actually does demonstrate a certain disrespect for people, maybe not their mom directly, but, you know, people that have been doing that labor, that they're automating out of that process. So I think that there's definitely a lot there. Also, the fact that a lot of computers, a lot of human computers were women, and that kind of factored into how their roles were disrespected, and how they were devalued and thus seen as candidates for automation. I think that says a lot. I was also going to flag too that the disrespect doesn't necessarily always, it's not just about sort of who we're replacing with automation, but also all of the data that goes into it. I think there's a lot to learn. There's a lot of learning that's happening right now in the machine learning community around the respecting data subjects, respecting people's information as we make use of it, treating humans with dignity, even to be represented by a data point rather than in our faces. So I think there's definitely a lot as a field that we're learning about just respecting other human beings and being mindful of their humanity as we deal with their data, and also like disrupt their lives with whatever we build.
Yeah, this topic of respecting contributions calls to mind for me the recent release of the movie Social Dilemma, and how you could look at that as a case of the folks who built and got rich off of these systems then kind of raising alarms without highlighting the folks that are doing the work to raise these issues. I'm curious, Shalini, from your perspective as a director of someone who put heart and soul into a work like this, how that resonates for you, and of course Deb and Meredith as well, your perspectives.
Just on the social dilemma and in context to coded bias and
yes.
Well, I think
there, at least.
Jeff Orlowski, who's the director of Social Dilemma, is a friend and a colleague through the Sundance Institute, who I've known for a long time. We both did films about climate change before this. I'm delighted my film is often compared to his film because I think he had a lot more money to work with. So it's great that we're in the same conversation. I'm delighted to be in that conversation. But I actually think that we're at the beginning of a conversation, and both films have a role and a perspective to play. Jeff and Tristan both come from inside the industry. They're, both know each other from Stanford. Many of the people in the film are, sort of tech insiders that actually built the systems that I'm sort of critiquing in Coded Bias. And I think that that's important too. I think that he probably has a Rolodex that won't take my phone call, and maybe vice versa. And so when we talk about inclusion, I think from a filmmaking perspective, I don't have this idea that like every film has to have this like Noah's Ark. There needs to be 2 Latinx people. There needs to be 2 LGBTQ people. There needs to be 2, I'm not of that belief. I think that there is a perspective. And I think my film comes from a very distinct perspective, and his comes from a very distinct perspective, and both are valuable in their own way and making their own commentary. But what I hope is that we're just at the beginning of understanding how these systems work. We're just catching up And we're interacting so closely, and these systems are changing the way we socialize in such major ways that I think we need all the tools that we can towards literacy, towards understanding how these systems work, so that we can make sure that we're using our best judgment for safety.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the contrast between coded bias and social dilemma is like a contrast I kind of feel in a lot of interactions I have with like other members of like the broader machine learning community versus like the people sort of doing the work on this sort of in this, fact, fairness, accountability space, or AI ethics space. I think that there is like not just the demographic difference between, a lot of women and people of color voicing the critique at the moment, and a lot of sort of insiders, like you mentioned, arriving at a different conclusion. But I think that there is this interesting contrast in terms of the type of concerns that people are raising. I think we are at the beginning of the conversation, but it's very clear that a lot of the researchers featured in coded bias, who happen to be more demographically diverse, but also in terms of the viewpoint represents one of discussing sort of impact to individuals, discussing privacy, discussing concerns around, how racism and sexism can be propagated through these systems in a way that can really disrupt the life of an individual. And I think the message from Social Dilemma was just a completely different set of concerns. And I think, there are valid concerns around like social media addiction. I think there was also, a conversation around misinformation. Both of them are very valid. Like surveillance and social media addiction are both problems that exist. But I think it was just interesting for me to see through the two films the difference between what a lot of minority communities are worried about when they see technology, and what a lot of these insiders are prioritizing when attempting to address these problems, or prioritizing when they talk about the limitations of technology. There's clearly a very distinct disconnect there.
And I think that everybody who saw The Social Dilemma should also see Coded Bias. They're really great films to see in dialogue with each other. One of the things that I think Shalini does so well in Coded Bias is she really gives a complete and thorough and surprising and educational perspective on what AI is and isn't. And that is incredibly hard to do. AI is sophisticated math. That's what it comes down to. When we're doing machine learning, what we're doing is computational statistics. And anybody who, in data journalism, which is my field of journalism, like we talk about numbers all the time, we make graphs. It is insanely difficult to talk about numbers, and especially talk about big numbers, because the human brain is not actually built to understand big numbers. We kind of experience 100 and a million as like roughly the same, but they're actually completely different. So talking about math is really hard. Doing a film about complex mathematical topics is really hard. And doing a film about complex mathematical topics and the way they play out in the world and interact with issues of social justice is insanely hard. So, this is the big win of Coded Bias. This is what Shalini has done so well, is she's brought all of these issues to life, and she allows us like a very accessible way into understanding them. And it allows the viewer to think about what are the other ways that AI might be impacting different aspects of life. And hopefully it makes people feel empowered to say no when AI is being used in a way that is inappropriate or is not in line with our values as a society.
Mm-hmm. Willie asks, how do we balance the need to address algorithmic specific issues, for example, facial recognition, with the need to push for broader societal change, for example, dismantling the carceral state? And when I think about Shalini, your bio, you're a director and an activist, and both Meredith and Deb, who just disappeared, who will be back shortly. um, Shalini, in your case, your activism is your art in many ways. Maybe you're doing other things and you can share some of the other things you're doing, but you've kind of dedicated yourself to this activism and expressing activism in your work. I think for a lot of folks, there's a separation between kind of their work and their life and their activism. How do we balance all of these issues to kind of drive for change?
Well, I am not someone who claims to have balance in my life. I won't say that, but what I will say is that you're absolutely right. My art is a practice of my activism and my practice of being an engaged citizen. I often like to think about my work in the context of a cinema movement called it was called the Third Cinema. It was a term coined by Latin American filmmakers. And they sort of believed that all art was political, all cinema was political, all films were political, whether you're watching Crazy Rich Asians or The Terminator, or, that they all have a politics. And sort of that cinema could be a tool for social change. And that is because it inspires empathy. And, in Meredith's, where she sort of questions what intelligence is. And I think in my own work, I sort of pull from that and sort of talk about intelligence in terms of what is intelligence without empathy. And so in my practice of film, it is this belief that through cinema, you have this experience of identifying with someone radically different than you. And in documentary, everyday people who are heroes. And so through that experience, you can actually move someone to spark social change, which is why I miss being in the theater when the lights go up and you get to engage and have a conversation. But I think even in the making of this film, the practice of documentaries reminds me perpetually that everyday people can make a big difference. And I've seen that already in the making of this film. In June, we saw sea change that we never thought possible, which was that the biggest tech companies in the world, three of the biggest, IBM said that they would stop researching and deploying and selling facial recognition to law enforcement. Microsoft said it would stop selling facial recognition to law enforcement, and Amazon said it would put a 1-year pause on sale of facial recognition to law enforcement. That was sea change that we never thought possible, and it happened through the incredible groundbreaking research of Joy Buolamwini and Deb Raji and Timnit Gebru and all of the people that came before, and sort of built the field. And also people in the streets who made those connections between racially biased, invasive surveillance technology and civil rights. And so I think that I really have seen firsthand that films can spark the kind of conversations that make social change, which is why I'm so grateful to be part of this conversation and for people watching the film and chatting with us on a Saturday. But also that this is kind of the way the world changes, and especially on an issue where we're just at the beginning of public understanding. And if we can start to share the film and read all of the books of the people in the film and start to have these conversations at our dinner tables and with our colleagues, then we can start to have these conversations with our policymakers and at our companies.
Great. Meredith or Deb, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I was gonna say, I hear this question a lot actually, or it's implied a lot. It's implied very often. There's a lot of interesting tensions that people present, especially around, should we reform these systems or should we abolish them? Like, should we tear them down? And that tension comes up a lot, especially for facial recognition, where it is like very reason, like, there's very specific situations where it's clear that facial recognition is not the right tool given how dangerous it can be. But on the other hand, this is a tool that doesn't work for a specific population that's at risk of that mismatch escalating to the point of arrest, as in the case of Robert Williams. So there's that tension that always does exist with this work. I think my stance is that, often they're not actually really conflicting positions. A lot of the work that we've done to reveal like the dysfunction and the limits of facial recognition systems have led to bans, especially in really sensitive situations like law enforcement. And the reason we were able to do that is because, if it doesn't work for a particular group, why is it on the market? And that's exactly what Shalini was sort of mentioning around these big tech companies realizing, because, when we first, they weren't very nice to us when we first published the paper and were in the press, especially Amazon, sort of the first time. I still remember very vividly the experience of first publishing our audit results and Amazon's response to that being very defensive. And I remember, subsequently after a bit of back and forth, especially with a lot of expressed support from the research community, where they landed and where Microsoft was at the time and IBM at the time in terms of messaging in response to our study was, oh, we support, we are supportive of facial recognition regulation, but we're still going to continue to sell it to police. We're still going to have it on the market. And I think now we're, like Shalini mentioned, we're at the beginning of a very long journey of public education. And I think we're getting at a point where people can finally say that, wait, if a system is sort of systematically dysfunctional for a particular group and not working for a particular group, it shouldn't be on the market. We should pull it out of the market completely. It shouldn't be sold. It shouldn't be affecting people's lives if it's sort of consistently putting their lives at risk. So I think that's something that is a very recent development, that level of understanding about how serious this issue is and how the disproportionate impact of these systems does necessitate sometimes us making the move to remove them as part of what it means to move forward as a society or move towards a more just society. So I do think that those are not like opposing goals, but complementary goals in a lot of ways. Changing this technology definitely factors into the change that needs to happen for society.
Mm-hmm.
So Sam, I think your question was about the interplay between art and activism and computer science.
I think
and so
the question more broadly was about activism and how you express your activism through your work, and maybe for folks that have not integrated their work and their activism, how they, can or should be thinking about being active in these areas that we're discussing.
So I think that Joy is really an inspiration in this regard. She's an artist, she's an activist, she's a computer scientist. And I love that the world has changed to a point where those pursuits can be integrated. So I'm a writer. I'm an artist. Journalism is my job. And computer science was my job. And I care deeply about the issues of the world. And it's nice to be able to integrate all of those things in the field of artificial intelligence. So the fight against facial recognition, I'm so pleased with the developments in the fight against the use of facial recognition in policing that have come about as a result of the film. And I think that Joy's path from doing an art project to testifying as testifying before Congress about the evils of facial recognition that we see in the film is a really inspiring progression. And so I do hope that it helps other people to think about, okay, if you're passionate about a kind of art and you're passionate about an issue, how can you bring these things together? In artificial intelligence, I'm particularly excited about the policy work that's happening. And I would point to Deb's work on auditing algorithms as an inspiration here. Also, Kathy O'Neill's work on auditing algorithms. So lots of people will look at the problem of facial recognition algorithm and say, oh, well, yeah, it doesn't work on some people, but we need it anyway, so we're just going to use it. And maybe we'll just make the training data more diverse and that will fix things. Joy's work is so amazing because she says, no, that's not the fix. The fix is actually to ban this because this technology is weaponized against people of color, against poor people. It has disparate impact, right? And so one of the ways that we can better use algorithms in the world is we can audit them. Okay, so pointing to Deb's work, again, let's audit the algorithms. Let's do that within a policy framework. And then let's do that in order to achieve a more just and equitable future.
And just to add to that, there are fantastic organizations in the field doing this work, and that's what the film aims to do, is build a coalition among the longtime stakeholders in the field. And you can go to codedbias.com and click on the Take Action page, and you'll find links to the Algorithmic Justice League, to the ACLU, to organizations on the ground like Mi Gente, who are stopping No Tech for ICE, and other ongoing campaigns. And one easy way that people can tap in is to support these great organizations who are doing work in the field.
One of the themes that recurred through the film is this contrast between what's happening in the West, namely the US and the UK, and China. This is raising a question by Plan in the YouTube chat. This one specifically maybe to Shalini, about this conversation with this woman who is effusively enthusiastic about China's social credit system. And Plan is curious, what the context was of that. Did she know that this was going to be a part of this documentary?
Yes.
Just
to give a little context, I will say that China doesn't have freedom of press, of an independent media, and so it would have been likely dangerous to get someone who is speaking out against facial recognition without promise of protecting their identity. And it was something that we thought a lot about when we were undertaking those scenes. And so we got someone who, that was actually what she thought. I mean, we didn't tell her to say anything. This is actually what she thought. And so what I think is so interesting about it is you sort of think, oh, that's a galaxy far, far away. But, when was the last time you were about to meet someone and looked up how many Instagram followers they had, or, Google stalked them once before you were thinking about hiring them? Like, there are all kinds of ways in which our behavior is being shaped by what Kathy O'Neill says so well as algorithmic obedience training. And I also thought, what I thought was so interesting and parallel about that scene with, and I think in the film, it was important to look at three approaches to data, like the example in China, which is this unfettered access to data by an authoritarian regime, where people scan their face as part of a scoring system and say how convenient it is. but it is, I think for me, it was that line, because it was the point in which we lose part of ourselves for efficiency. And I think in Coded Bias, there were so many moments where I was like, oh, wow, this is the line where civil liberties gets crossed. And it's invisible and opaque to us, and it takes a lot even to understand it. For instance, in the UK, where there are laws, but at the same time you see a citizen pulling his face up because he doesn't want to be subject to a random identity check by police. And I tried to make I thought it was important to make these parallels to South Africa being arbitrarily stopped with the ID cards by police, and how these are things that we associate with an authoritarian state. These are not things that we associate with a democracy. And so I think that that moment where the man holds his shirt up and gets ticketed.
It's a fine.
Yes, it's a fine. And it's also, wow, that's the moment. That's how the police overstep happens. Or when Jim Jordan says, when I was watching Joy testify before Congress, and Jim Jordan, a Republican from Ohio, says, wait a minute, 100, this is something you don't see on TV, Republican from Ohio and AOC, Democrat from Queens agreed. I saw it in real life with my own eyes. But basically, there was a moment where Jim Jordan said 117 million Americans are in a police database that they don't need a warrant to access, and there's no one in an elected office overseeing this process. And to me, I thought that was such an example of how it's going right from technology companies to law enforcement with essentially nothing in between. And that's why the work that Joy and Deborah and Timna did was so very important.
What struck me in the segment about the facial recognition in the UK, beyond the fact that the individual gets the ticket for not participating in the system, was it was mentioned that the system had a 98% false positive rate. That's crazy.
It's crazy. And we only have that data because of the UK. Because of the GDPR in the UK and the work of Silky Carlo and Big Brother Watch, that we have that data. In the US, we don't have data. The first US citizen was wrongly accused, a Detroit man who was held for 30 hours, arrested in front of his family and his neighbors, and never asked for his license. Because of facial recognition. And in spite of that, the Detroit police is going forward with use of facial recognition. So all of that is to say, as terrifying it was to see those scenes in the UK, keep in mind that I can't even get that information as a journalist here in the US because these tools are being used in secret, and that's kind of terrifying.
Mm-hmm. Meredith or Deb, any comment on the US, UK, West, East, China contrast that the film presents?
Yeah, I really love that part of the film. I thought it was very well done. I think sometimes, I think it was well done for a couple of reasons. One being that sometimes I think people try to make the contrast to China to be like, oh, we're, China is so much worse. And, we're here in the US and in the land of the free. And I think this documentary did a good job showing that, you might be seeing these things happening in, the UK and China and other countries, but here's how it shows up in the US. It takes on different forms. Accountability looks different. In terms of acceptance and social understanding of these systems, that's different. And here's the result of those differences, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we've escaped, or we've escaped any kind of surveillance state or any kind of a level of monitoring just because we happen to be in a democratic society. And I thought that was very well done, where the narrative wasn't necessarily, it was very kind of an open-minded approach rather than just playing off of the common narratives that we hear around facial recognition use in other countries to sort of paint the US as this advancing figure. And I think there was actually an interview that you had with, I think, Zainab, or you had an interview in there of someone that was really speaking directly to this, where she had mentioned, like, you know, we have all of these conceptions of what China is and what surveillance in China is. And it's not that those conceptions are wrong or that they're not politically valid in terms of a critique of that political regime that they endure there. But we can't pretend that none of those issues are issues that are relevant to the US. There's many dimensions of the issues that we see of surveillance technology in China that are directly related to things that we should be worried about in the US, but we just are not aware of, or we don't have access to the data, or we don't have an understanding of how it plays out in our lives. So I thought that was just very well done in the documentary. And I think that was one of the sort of key takeaways from that dynamic that exists. The other thing I wanted to flag too was that opportunity for accountability that exists in the US, where like in a democratic society, like ideally the government represents the people and is protecting the well-being of the people. How well that actually plays out. I'm a very optimistic person, so I don't know like how well that actually plays out. But ideally, you know, regulation is there for the protection of the people, and you know, people in Congress should be, if they really care about their constituents, they should understand their role or their responsibility to really push forward regulation to protect those constituents. And something that I've always found very interesting about facial recognition regulation, because there's a couple of bills now that are being debated in Congress and at the state level and the local level in different regions of the US and in Canada, is that it is like a very bipartisan issue, strangely, you know, where it's not yet been politicized. So you have a lot of these bills, you know, co-sponsored by you know, a Republican and a Democrat, and a lot of these committees investigating sort of some of these privacy issues, you know, representing the full political spectrum. So I think that there is something to be said about that in terms of my personal hope to see some level of accountability emerge in the future. And that being uniquely possible in the US versus other countries, I think hopefully there's a lot of potential for that to play out here.
One thing that jumped out at me as being unique about our setup in the US and uniquely frustrating maybe is that you've got these government agencies or using technology developed by commercial companies, you know, think of like a ProPublica, and using the kind of commercial IP as a shield for, you know, seeing what's actually happening. And then the commercial companies are saying, well, you know, we need regulation, you know, it's on the government. And so you have this kind of accountability loop that you can see taking shape.
Yeah, it becomes even weirder when you go to a policy meeting with the government and then you see like, you know, a bunch of corporations there as well, where they'll invite like advocacy groups, and there'll be like maybe 2 or 3 seats for advocacy groups and like 30 seats for corporate representatives. And it took me a long time to actually understand the level of lobbying that happens and how that really does shape a lot of the political outcomes and practical outcomes of like the US government system. I think I was very naive, you know, right after the Amazon announcement to halt facial recognition sale to the police for a year. I think I was very naive about their strategy. And the more I've been engaging with, you know, the policy side of things, I'm realizing that what it actually meant was them doubling down on their investment of like lobbyists. Like there's Amazon lobbyists in every corner of every conversation of facial recognition in Congress right now.
Are they lobbying for this thing they say they want? Are they actively lobbying for regulation? I find that hard to believe.
I don't think. I think they know that facial recognition is sort of this in public interest. It's a desired outcome for a lot of people in the U.S. and as a result of that, a lot of representatives feel like they need to push for it. But I think Amazon is advocating for a very specific type of regulation that, well, I don't even want to say anything, but I will say that, yeah, I don't think whenever I'm in the rooms of these companies, they're not necessarily advocating to be even further restricted. Like, you know, they're bringing up issues around IP and concerns that are very relevant in the corporate context, but might not necessarily be what's best for the people affected. And I think this plays back to that earlier question of, what's the difference between social dilemma and coded bias? I really think that, there's just different priorities coming from both sides. I think a lot of the advocates that Shalini thankfully highlighted in her documentary, because I don't think, that perspective is necessarily as visible always. So a lot of those advocates, they have very specific concerns because they're working with the affected population directly. And a lot of the times the contrast you see between, an Amazon lobbyist's version of what regulation means and an advocate's version of what regulation means is that one person is prioritizing, a bottom line, and the other person is prioritizing actual people. And it leads to sort of this inevitable tension that needs to get resolved. So yeah, I think we're at a point where regulation, is likely to happen, but I do think will the regulation be what we need in order to actually protect people? That really depends on a lot of factors. And I'm not sure if corporate involvement is going to move us towards the kind of regulation we need to protect those people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would put it even more plainly. I would say that getting tech companies to design tech regulation is like asking the fox to guard the hen house, right? Like, yes, they're going to design regulation. And yes, everybody thinks we need regulation. But if you're asking Amazon to design the regulation or asking Facebook to design it, you're just going to end up with the same problems we have now, because these companies have been self-governing for the entire time they've been in existence. And self-governance was the key word, the operating principle for the early internet. And self-governance is what got us to police use of facial recognition. Like, self-governance is what got us to all the things that Facebook is doing to undermine democracy. So it's maybe not a great idea to have the tech companies designing the regulation. Maybe we should look outside.
Yeah,
Don't leave the tech bros alone. That's what I always say. What's the solution? I say, don't leave the tech bros alone. Don't leave them alone in the laboratory. Don't leave them alone in governance.
Shalini, in the film you highlighted. Shalini, in the film you highlighted the this experiment that Facebook did with influencing elections, and I don't know if you foresaw how we would feel about watching that in 10 days out from the election, but it was very bracing, chilling, and seemed particularly poignant. I'm curious if I'm curious your kind of thoughts about the aspect that Meredith just raised. This whole kind of, I think we're starting to see, or it starts to feel like that democracy has a certain level of fragility to it that is apparent, more poignant in 2020 than perhaps in years past. I'm wondering if that's something that you meant to directly take on and kind of what that all means for you.
Oh, absolutely. I think absolutely. And that Facebook scene was in and out of the film for a really long time. My editors tell you that we were back and forth, and it was cut and it wasn't cut. There were two scenes that were like that. And so we ultimately put it in because everyone who saw it was so astounded by it. And because it was a long, as a filmmaker, I'm trying to sort of gauge how much how much sort of conversational exposition you're putting in. But I think that was so astounding because it was a scientific study done twice, published in Nature, and also showed this sort of this nudge of power. in this subtle change of I voted plus icons or I voted no icons of your friends' faces, and how that what could be enough to swing an election with nobody looking. And by the way, of course, they can tell what political dispositions we are based on our Facebook profiles. I almost put nothing on my Facebook profile, and I was just looking at myself. I was like, oh yeah, it's all there. Like, you can know it all. You know, like, and so it's very interesting to me. And so I don't think we've yet reconciled with that nudge of power in our lives, of that silent hand of, would you like to read this book next? Would you like to see this movie next? Would you like to vote for this person? Would you like, as Zainab says, like, would you like discount tickets to Vegas? You know, if you're a compulsive gambler. And so it can know those things about you. And so I think that is very unsettling, especially as we come to terms with the impact that sort of misinformation and predatory information has already had on our democracy.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, the dynamic between sort of algorithms and like influence or persuasion has always been very alarming. I was recently watching the Channel 4 investigation on like how the Trump campaign had pretty much through their data director at the time, which I think was Brad Pascal, they had sort of orchestrated this whole campaign to identify voters that were borderline, but this is in 2016, and voting for the opponent, and then actively discourage them from voting. That was the claim that Channel 4 had done, and they had gotten a bunch of data around it. And it was just really fascinating for me to see that investigation play out, because it was, a really clear example of how there, with advertising has always sort of been discriminatory. And I had a great conversation with civil rights lawyer about this, where they were saying, it's so hard to go after Facebook for their advertising bias, because you have different organizations that will only put their ads up in a particular neighborhood that they know has a particular demographic, or they'll only advertise their product in a particular magazine that they know is going to go to a particular demographic. So, advertising is sort of this inherently discriminatory act, and it has this history of creating profiles and stereotypes and pitching things and making suggestions based off of that. So it's so hard legally to go after these algorithms that are just doing that same thing. But I think with the example that I mentioned around, and Cambridge Analytica definitely exemplified this as well, where the amount of reach that you have when you do that kind of algorithmic manipulation, but also how it can really escalate to the point of not just you convincing someone to buy A or buy B, but convincing them to not vote in an election where they have that right to vote, and like pretty much engaging in that level of voter suppression and compromising democracy and the democratic process in that way. It was just such an alarming step where, I don't know how as a field we kind of went from, buy the pink sweater versus the red sweater based off of, your personality type, to really, challenging the democratic values that the country was built on. So the escalation of the impact of data science and AI.
Deb's frozen.
Oh no.
Oh, no.
While we wait for Deb to get connected back in, Meredith, I'm curious if you have a unique perspective on this as a journalism. Journalistic institutions have, endorsed candidates and participated in the political process overtly. Facebook is certainly not a journalistic institution, but I'm wondering if there's a unique take that you have coming from that. Coming from journalism?
I would say that Facebook is a publisher. They like to pretend that they're not, because that allows them to use CDA 230 as a shield. So CDA 230 is the clause that that says that telecom companies cannot be held responsible for what users do with their networks. And it was designed back in the pre-Facebook era. And it was designed for a company like Verizon, who owned telephones. And Verizon didn't want to be responsible for people committing crimes using telephone wires. And, that makes sense. Like, no, we wouldn't hold Verizon responsible. But if Facebook pretends it's not a publisher, then it's protected just like Verizon. Oh, Deb, welcome back.
Yeah, it took me a second to realize I had gone off. So I finished my whole spiel. I don't know how much of that you heard.
It was great. I loved it.
I'm having connection issues here, clearly.
It was a very science fiction like image stick.
Facebook doesn't want you to hear the message I have to say. So
That's what I always say.
Yeah. They're definitely listening and monitoring your bandwidth. We lost net neutrality, so that's the consequence.
It's the next horizon. I knew it was going to happen this way.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Meredith. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Okay, so I was talking about Facebook is actually a publisher. So I just think it's quaint, like, to think about the fact that we had a time when tech companies claimed, oh, well, whatever we're doing on our social network doesn't matter. Like, it's really not going to influence people. And, the icons we do, the simple choices we make, like, we just have the autonomy to make these choices. Like, don't worry about this. This is going to be fine. Like, it's absurd now, in retrospect, that we ever thought that.
Yeah.
We didn't know that. Shalini is putting it on film that, there's a massive study with massive impact that demonstrates that in a very sensitive context.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to
definitely look at the people who are trying to reform CDA 230. That's a very, very interesting, very, very interesting debate.
Daryl says that AI cannot stop Deb. She's back.
It is 100% true.
I will speak my truth. I was actually just going to add really quickly to what Meredith, you just mentioned around social media platforms being a publisher. Last week was the MTech conference, which was sort of the MIT Tech Reviews sort of conference around a lot of these sort of emerging topics. And there was an interesting moment where there was someone from Twitter that was being asked questions around, what he sees as the responsibility of the platform and the engineers working on these systems to address, the disinformation challenges that they have on that platform. And he was sort of trying to circumvent the question of like, oh, well, there's only so much we can do. And then it kind of, there was a good sort of interaction that happened where someone was like, well, any other publisher has that editorial control, which we know these social media platforms do have, but also a sense of that. And I don't know, Meredith, if you could probably speak more to this, but there is a sense of sort of an ethical code that journalists need to uphold and understand in terms of fact checking, in terms of their role as navigators of truth and as people that control that public conversation. And it just seemed as if that was not part of the understanding of these tech companies of like how they manage the information on their platforms. Like, I'm curious as to how much that actually bleeds over in terms of the decades and centuries of, the ethics conversation happening in journalism and how that plays into some of the social media ethical issues that we see today. I don't know if they're related at all, but it definitely feels as if there's lessons to learn from journalism for these social media companies.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I teach at NYU journalism, and we have a code of ethics that our students learn. In journalism, the major organizations all have codes of ethics. Individual publications have codes of ethics, and it governs things like, as you said, like fact checking, what kind of, when can you accept money from somebody who you might want to write about, which is to say never, right? So, it's not great for, Like, journalism is not a place where you get rich. Tech is a place where you get rich. Like, that's one of the big differences. So something else that is notable is that the ACM, the major professional organization for computer scientists, wrote a code of ethics in the early 90s and only updated it within the past 2 years.
Yeah.
Right. So, and they had formally an ethics requirement in computer science curricula, but nobody paid attention to it. So the great thing about the tech ethics and the AI ethics movement right now is that people are paying attention to ethics, and they're saying, if we are going to create technologies, then the technologies have to be ethically implemented. And so the field of ethical AI, which is the field that is explored in coded bias, is really just exploding nowadays. We don't know everything about how do we make ethical algorithms. We don't know everything about how do we regulate technology in an ethical way, but we're working our way through it. It's really hard. It's harder than anybody imagined. And the only way we're going to get there is by having conversations as a society about these really complicated topics.
Mm-hmm. I really like that you said that AI ethics is exploding. I remember because I was working with Joy when before the initial Gender Shades paper came out, and there was so much like fear and uncertainty around how it would be received and what would happen. And I'm glad that we're now. And one of the reasons I started working with Joy in the first place is because she was literally like the only person I could find after pages of Google of someone else that was thinking about the same problems. So I'm really excited that now there's so many different institutions and groups excited about this topic and ready to work on it.
Yeah, so, it is really exciting.
Mm-hmm. So Shalini, I've got a couple of favorite quotes from the film, and I wanted to share those and get your take on your favorites. And if Meredith and Deb, if you also have favorites, don't want to put you on the spot because I was doing this beforehand. But one was when about an hour in, I think, Joy says, accuracy draws attention, but we can't forget about abuse. Even if I'm perfectly classified, that just enables surveillance. I think that spoke to kind of the broader challenge here. She started with this one specific thing that this device she was trying to build could not recognize her face. And then as part of this journey, she realized that even if it did, we still have all these issues that we need to address. And then the other, I forget the speaker, but she said, I think the thing I fear is not that we'll go down this 1984 totalitarian route, but rather that our, rights will be quietly eroded effectively via surveillance. Also, I think a very powerful statement of, what is at risk here. What were the most, salient quotes or moments for you in the film?
Well, I love that. I feel like a cult classic of of something where you're quoting Orwellian quotes from my documentary. It's all very exciting. Written by feminists. I love it. It's just amazing to me. I don't know. I'm just I'm happy not to be editing it anymore. I know all the quotes. I know all of the dialogue in the film very well, so I won't recite it by heart.
Nice. Deb or Meredith, do you have any particular moments that were most impactful for you?
There's this scene that's really funny where it's Kathy O'Neill, and she's like, for some reason, she has like a Rubik's Cube in her hand. And I know Shalini has more context on how that happened, but she's talking about, and she has a Rubik's Cube in her hand and she's solving it. And it's like, okay, but the words coming out of her mouth are something like math can be incredibly dangerous and it messes up people's lives. So it's just the juxtaposition of, someone that's obviously very competent and, inclined to sort of solve these puzzles and is doing so very easily, talking about the fact that, the mathematical tools that help her solve this Rubik's Cube and understand how to algorithmically address that, that puzzle, are sort of the same algorithms that, are affecting people's lives, are part of this bigger issue in terms of the ethical issues in algorithms. So I just thought it was such a funny juxtaposition of like, someone that's clearly just like solving this Rubik's Cube, and also like the words coming out of her mouth too. It was just like it was almost like ironic to see both of those images together and have her saying those things.
I can share how that was shot is that Cathy O'Neil, in addition to like being like a PhD from Harvard in mathematics, is also has a bluegrass band, which Meredith and Joy have all on the cutting room floor is a night of all of them jamming out together.
Oh, I remember that party. That was amazing.
Yes, and so basically,
Joy was like playing music, right?
Yes, and so playing music, and so Cathy O'Neil. This is my first time meeting her. I had read her book, so I knew she went to math camp and was into Rubik's cubes. Yeah. So I brought a Rubik's Cube, and Cathy comes in. It was like a Saturday or something, and she's hungover. She comes in and she's like sort of stumbling in, sits into place because she was jamming out with her band the night before, and sees the messed up Rubik's Cube, because I can't solve a Rubik's Cube, right? So I have the Rubik's Cube here, and literally you see her sit down. She looks and she sees it. You see a second, like it clicks, and she's like, "Give me the Rubik's Cube." and then my DP, my camera person is like just setting up. I'm like, and so quickly she like solves it.
It was so funny. It was such a good juxtaposition. I don't know if you made her say that or if that just naturally came out of her mouth.
That was editing, but that moment.
Okay, that was amazing.
That moment was verite.
The overlay was beautiful.
Nice. How about you, Meredith? Any favorite moments?
Oh, every moment is my favorite. I mean, especially the bowling scene, of course. I love the interplay between Joy and AOC. And I would just say that if you loved the film, like, go out and read the books of the amazing people in the film. Great. Read all of Joy's work, read Deb's work, read Amy Webb, read Sophia Noble, read Cathy O'Neil, read Zainab. It creates an amazing syllabus, and those are some terrific insights into what AI can and can't do.
Yeah, all the links are on the Coded Bias website, by the way, codedbias.com.
It's great.
You can scroll down. What?
I said, and read Meredith's book too. It's great.
And the link is on the page. If you need a link to it, it's all there.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay, that's very convenient.
Well, we'll grab those and put them on the session page as well for folks. All of the amazing books came up in our group viewing in the Slack conversation, and it was proposed to do a TWIML book club around the books in this film. So
I love this.
That's a great idea.
Great idea.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for not just participating in the session, but also being a part of this amazing film and the incredible work that you're doing.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much. This was great.
Thanks so much, Sam.
Happy
Thank you. And thanks everyone for tuning in and for your great questions and participation. We'll catch you all soon.